The entire western town was in shock when dozens of men from ranch hands to the mayor himself tested positive for HIV, and they all pointed their fingers at one woman, Evelyn Shaw. They called her the devil who brought death. But was it the truth, or a vile conspiracy hiding in plain sight? The noon sun hung over Redstone like a judgment, hot and blinding, spilling its light across the wooden scaffold in the center of town. Dust rose with every footstep curling into the air, as if reluctant to settle, as if even the ground knew something wrong was about to be done. Evelyn Shaw stood at the top of the platform, wrists bound, the coarse rope looped around her neck. Her dress, once white, was torn, stained from dirt, and the rough hands that had dragged her here. At her feet, clinging to the hem like frightened kittens, were her children. Noah's small fingers trembled against her leg, Nell's face pressed into the fabric, muffling sobs. She didn't cry. Her eyes were steady, though the skin beneath them was shadowed from sleepless nights. In the hush that came before the shouting began again, she looked past the sea of faces, neighbors, shopkeepers, men she'd massaged for aching backs and tired hands, and thought of the small room she'd left that morning, where her children's medicine sat half-used on the table. The mayor, Jeb Caro, stepped forward. His voice carried the sharp edge of a man who'd learned long ago how to cut without lifting a blade. "This woman," he declared, "is a plague upon this town, a disease in human form. She's spread her filth to good, honest men. She's cost lives, and today justice will be done." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Evelyn felt the sting of their eyes, each gaze another stone thrown. She searched the faces for one hint of doubt, one flicker of mercy. "Tell them," Jeb said, turning to her with a smirk. "Tell them what you've done, and maybe you'll leave this earth a little cleaner than you've lived on it." Her voice, when it came, was quiet but unwavering. "I have done no harm," she said. "I have touched men, yes, with my hands, to ease the knots in their backs, the aches in their shoulders. I have taken their coins so my children might breathe a little easier at night. But I have never," her words caught, "never lain with a man since my husband died." Jeb laughed low and bitter. "You hear that, folks? A saint in rags. She'll tell you the moon's made of silver next." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Liar, another, string her up." Noah whimpered, and Evelyn lowered her head to whisper to him, "Close your eyes, my love. Just listen to my voice." Her lips brushed his hair, and for a moment she was back in their little cabin, humming him to sleep. From the edge of the crowd, a figure in a trail-worn coat and dusted hat watched without moving. Luke Donovan's face was weathered by miles and grief, but his eyes were sharp. He'd come into Redstone for supplies, not salvation, but what he saw on that platform stirred something in him he thought he'd buried with his past. The hangman stepped forward, adjusting the rope, his hands impersonal as a butcher's. Jeb gave a nod. Luke's voice cut through the square. "Hold it." Heads turned. He stepped into the open, the sun catching the faint silver at his temples. "You've got the wrong woman." Jeb's lip curled. "And you are someone who's seen enough injustice to know the shape of it." Luke moved closer, boots scuffing the boards. "You say she made you sick, that all these men took ill because of her. But you've got no proof, just whispers and fear. Tell me, Mayor, what's fear worth to a man like you, enough to hang a mother in front of her children?" A murmur swelled in the crowd. Not agreement, not yet, just the sound of people remembering their own doubts. "This is no concern of yours," Jeb said, his voice cooling into a threat. "Step aside, or you'll swing next to her." Luke's gaze flicked to Evelyn, to the children clutching her. "If that's the cost, I'll pay it. But you'll answer a question first. Who else has been with every man here? Who else has the power to scare them into silence?" For the first time, Jeb's eyes shifted. Just a flicker. Enough. Luke saw it. So did a few others. Evelyn closed her eyes. She could feel the heat of the boards under her feet, the roughness of the rope on her neck, and beneath it all, a strange stillness. She thought of her husband's voice on the day he died, telling her to be brave for the children. Jeb barked, "Enough, pull the lever." But the hangman hesitated, his gaze darting from Luke to the crowd. The air thickened with the weight of unspoken things. Luke stepped onto the platform. In one swift motion, his knife sliced through the rope around Evelyn's wrists. Gasps rippled. "She walks out of here with me," he said. "Alive. And if you want her back, you'll have to prove she's guilty." Chaos erupted, shouts, the scrape of boots, the rustle of skirts, as townsfolk stepped back, unsure whose side they were on. Luke lifted Noah into his arms, took Nell's hand, and pulled Evelyn toward the edge. Bullets might have followed them, if not for the sheer shock that held the crowd still. By the time anyone moved, they were already at Luke's horse, Evelyn mounting behind him with the children pressed close. As they rode hard out of Redstone, the dust swallowed the scaffold, the mayor's voice, the faces twisted by fear. Evelyn didn't look back. She only tightened her arms around her children and let the wind carry away the last of her strength. Luke glanced over his shoulder, once saw the town shrinking against the horizon, and said quietly, "They'll come after us." Evelyn's reply was barely more than a breath. "Then let them. I have nothing left to lose but the truth." For the first time in years, Luke felt the old pull of a fight worth having, not for gold, not for glory, but for something fragile and fierce. And in the space between hoofbeats as the sun dipped lower, he knew he wasn't riding toward trouble. He was riding toward the start of something worth keeping. The noonday sun in Redstone was a mean, pitiless thing pouring down on the dust-choked square until the air itself seemed to waver. The crowd had swelled tight around the gallows boots, grinding grit into the hard-packed ground. Somewhere, a baby cried. Somewhere else, a man spat and muttered, "End it quick." Evelyn stood on the platform, wrists bound in front of her rope, brushing her collarbone. Her dress, once white, was streaked with the dirt of hands that had shoved her this way and that. Two small faces peered up from the crowd. Noah's eyes wide and wet, Nell's cheeks streaked with tears, held back by the grasp of a woman Evelyn barely knew. The children's hands reached for her trembling, their voices swallowed by the roar of accusation. From the front of the crowd, Mayor Jeb Caro stepped forward, a self-satisfied weight in every stride. His face was red from heat, and anger, his words sharp enough to cut. "She's a disease," he declared, his voice booming across the square. "She's taken good men and sent them to their graves. I'll see her swing for what she's done." Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came. She'd said her truth enough times to know it no longer carried weight. In their eyes, her silence was confession. She fixed her gaze on the horizon instead, where the hills shimmered like mirages, and tried to remember the smell of her children's hair before all this began. That's when Luke Donovan saw her. He had ridden into Redstone just before noon, dust on his boots, the brim of his hat, casting a shadow over eyes that had seen more than they cared to. He hadn't meant to stop just water, the horse maybe get a meal, but the sound of the crowd had drawn him in. And now he stood at the edge, one hand resting on the worn leather of his gun belt, studying the woman on the platform. Something in the way she held herself shoulders straight, despite the rope chin up, though her eyes were rimmed red, cut through the noise. Guilt didn't look like that, Luke thought. Guilt shifted and squirmed. This was something else. The hangman stepped forward, adjusting the knot with a businesslike tug. Jeb gave a sharp nod. "Do it." Luke moved then, his voice carrying over the restless hum. "Hold on." The crowd turned, grumbles rising. Luke didn't hurry. He pushed through the press of bodies until he stood 10 paces from the platform. "You planning to kill her without hearing the whole of it?" he asked, his tone even almost mild. Jeb sneered. "Stranger, we've heard enough. Every man she's touched is either dead or dying. That's proof enough." Luke's eyes narrowed. "Proof is more than gossip, Mayor." A ripple went through the crowd. No one spoke to Jeb Caro that way. Evelyn's breath caught. She didn't know this man, but the steadiness in his voice felt like a rope thrown into dark water. Jeb stepped closer to the edge of the platform, looking down on Luke. "And who are you to meddle in Redstone's affairs? Someone who doesn't much like watching a rope take an innocent neck." Luke said, his gaze never leaving Jeb's. "And I've got reason to believe she's not the one you should be looking at." The murmurs grew louder. The hangman hesitated. Jeb's tone turned icy. "Reason, or just a bleeding heart for a pretty face?" Luke's mouth tightened. The kind of reason that comes from knowing where disease really starts. And it isn't from her. His hand rested near the butt of his Colt, not as a threat, but as a promise. Evelyn's eyes met his then. She didn't dare speak, but the question in them was clear. "Why? Why risk yourself for me?" Luke answered with the barest shake of his head. There'd be time for words later, if they lived through this. Jeb laughed a short, sharp bark. "You've got a lot of nerve, Donovan. I didn't give you my name." Luke cut in softly, the interruption cold enough to draw a collective breath from the crowd. The hangman stepped back, uncertainty in his eyes. The rope swayed slightly in the dry breeze. Somewhere behind Luke, a voice muttered, "Maybe the stranger's right." Jeb's face darkened. "Enough. Do your job." Luke moved faster than the command could land. His hand flashed and a single shot cracked the hot air, severing the rope just above the knot. The crowd gasped as the frayed end dropped, brushing Evelyn's shoulder. She stumbled forward, catching herself, the shock of sudden freedom almost as jarring as the fear had been. Shouts erupted. 2 of Jeb's men lunged, but Luke was already on the platform, pulling Evelyn toward the edge. "Move," he said, low and urgent. They hit the ground running. Luke's horse was tied just beyond the crowd. He swung her up into the saddle, untied the reins, and slapped the flank. The animal bolted, carrying Evelyn away from the square. Behind them, Nell and Noah's cries rose above the din. Luke turned, found the woman holding the children, and barked, "Bring them." She hesitated only a second before shoving through the chaos toward him. Bullets split the air. Luke's revolver was out, his shots clean, buying seconds that felt like all they had left. He grabbed Noah under one arm, helped the girl lift Nell to the saddle behind Evelyn, and mounted in one motion. Then, they were galloping down the narrow street, the shouts of pursuit fading beneath the pounding of hooves. For a long stretch, no one spoke. The only sound was wind and the rasp of breath. Evelyn clung to her children, her cheek against Noah's hair, feeling the thud of his heartbeat. Finally, she spoke, her voice a ragged whisper over the rush of air. "I don't know who you are, but thank you." Luke's reply was quiet, almost swallowed by the wind. "Don't thank me yet. We're not safe." Her hands tightened around the children. "We'll never be safe. Not until someone listens." Luke glanced at her, the set of his jaw softening just a fraction. "Then we'll make them listen." They rode until the sun began to dip, painting the land in long shadows. When they finally slowed near the cover of a dry creek bed, Evelyn slid from the saddle, her legs unsteady. Luke dismounted, tying the horse in the shade. The children clung to her skirts, their eyes still wide. He looked at her, then really looked at the dirt streaked across her cheek, the way her shoulders slumped, now that the danger had eased, the quiet strength in the way she held her children close. "You didn't do what they say," he said, not as a question. Her gaze met his steady, despite the tears brimming there. No, but that's not what matters to them. In Redstone, the truth is whatever the loudest man says it is. Luke was silent for a moment, the cicadas buzzing in the brush around them. Then he nodded once. Maybe. But I've seen louder men fall. In the fading light, something eased in her posture. Not trust, not yet, but the first loosening of a knot tied too tight for too long. She drew the children closer, and for the first time all day, let herself breathe. The prairie stretched out under a silver-blue dusk, the grass whispering in the wind, like it had secrets to keep. Luke led the mare into the shadow of an abandoned barn, the boards weathered to a color that matched his coat. Behind him, Evelyn carried her children. Noah, clinging to her neck, Nell's small hands knotted in her skirt. Their faces were pale from the ride, but they hadn't cried for miles. There's a point where fear gets too tired to make noise. Inside the barn smelled of dust and old hay. Luke struck a match, lit the stub of a candle he'd found wedged in a beam. The glow barely reached the corners, but it was enough to make the space feel less like a tomb. "You can put them down," he said quietly. His voice was low, almost a murmur. "It's safe here for tonight." Evelyn eased the children onto a blanket he'd thrown over a pile of straw. They curled into each other, their breathing quick, shallow. She stood a moment, her back to him, arms wrapped tight around her ribs. Luke watched her the way her shoulders trembled. He'd seen women hide tears before, but she was holding something heavier than grief. It was the kind of weight that bends a person's spine over the years. "You think I did it," she said finally, her voice thin as a reed in the wind. "I think a lot of things don't add up," Luke replied, "and I think folks in that town are faster with a rope than with the truth." She turned, then the candlelight catching her eyes dark ringed with fatigue. "I never touched them, Luke. Not one. I made my living with my hands. Yes, but it was massage, nothing more. Men came because their backs ached from work, because they wanted someone to talk to without their wives knowing. I charged $1. Sometimes they paid with potatoes. I saved every coin for medicine." She glanced toward the children. And it still wasn't enough. Luke's jaw tightened. "Then why's half the town swearing they? Because it's easier to ruin a woman than to tell the truth," she cut in. "And because the truth would get them killed." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "It's the mayor's wife. She's the one. She's been with more men than I can count. She got sick. She knew it. And when they started falling ill, she made them swear it was me. Or else." Evelyn's hands twisted in her skirt. "Do you know what 'or else' means in a town like this? They talk about cutting tongues about bodies strung up before sunrise. The barn seemed smaller, the air heavier. Luke had heard threats like that before, seen them carried out. "And you owe money to my grandmother," he said, remembering something the old woman had mentioned weeks back. "Yes." She didn't flinch. "I never met you before today. I only knew she was kind. She lent me what she could when the doctor doubled his price." For a while neither spoke. Outside the wind ran its fingers along the walls. Luke crouched, fed the candle stub into a small lantern he'd found, set it near the children. Nell's eyelids fluttered, then closed. Noah shifted in his sleep, pressing closer to his sister. "I've carried a lot of bad stories in my head," Luke said slowly. "Some of them mine, some of them other people's. But I don't carry lies long. If you're telling me the truth, I'll see to it the rest of the world hears it." Evelyn's laugh was quiet, bitter. "The world doesn't care about women like me." "Then we'll start with the town," he said. His tone wasn't warm, but it was steady, like the sound of a well rope hitting water. She studied him. "Why are you helping me?" Luke didn't answer right away. He leaned back against a beam, eyes on the dark window, where the last light was fading. Because I've watched men in power destroy people just to keep from looking in a mirror, and I'm tired of letting them win. Her face softened, not in trust yet, but in something close to relief. Thank you. He shook his head. Don't thank me. Not yet. The night deepened, the barn creaking in the wind. Luke laid his coat over the children, then took the rifle from his saddlebag. He sat by the door, keeping watch. Evelyn lay down beside her children, her eyes still open, staring at the lantern's thin glow. Hours later, a sound came from the fields, a faint snap of grass underfoot. Luke's hand tightened on the rifle. He caught Evelyn's gaze and held a finger to his lips. In the stillness, he could hear his own heartbeat and the slow, even breathing of two small children who didn't yet know the world wanted their mother dead. He rose, moved to the doorway, peered into the dark. Only the wind. Still, he stayed there until the cold crept into his bones. When he came back inside, Evelyn was sitting up watching him. "Do you ever get tired of carrying other people's burdens?" she asked. Luke eased down onto the straw across from her. "You don't get tired, you just get used to the weight, until one day you set one down and realize you can stand up straighter than you thought." She looked at her sleeping children. "I hope they get to know a world like that." Luke didn't say it, but he was thinking the same thing. And for the first time in a long while, he thought it might be possible. The wind had a way of carrying voices in Redstone, twisting them through alleyways and over fence rails until no one could say exactly where they'd begun. By late afternoon, Evelyn could hear the whispers before she even reached the well. She kept her eyes down the rope handles of the water pails, biting into her palms, but the tone, sharp, pitying, and just loud enough, slipped into her bones. "She's the reason Tom Harris is dying," someone muttered. "Men are fools, but she's the devil that let 'em burn." Another answered. The words lodged in her chest like splinters. She had never touched Tom Harris, never touched any of them, but truth she knew was slower than poison. Marshall Pike stood across the square leaning against a post, his hat brim shadowing his eyes. He didn't join in. He didn't stop it either. When her gaze brushed his, he shifted his weight, a silent man weighing things he didn't yet dare to say. "By the Mercantile, Mrs." Dobbins clutched her shawl tighter as Evelyn passed, murmuring to the man beside her. Evelyn caught the tail end, charging them for sickness she didn't have the decency to warn him about. Her throat tightened. The lie was growing legs. Luke waited by the hitching rail, his hand resting on the neck of his horse. "You don't have to go through town," he said quietly. "There's the back trail." "I've walked this way every day for 5 years, she answered, setting the pails down. Her voice was steady, though she could feel her pulse racing. "If I start hiding, they'll think the stories are true." "They already do," Luke said. Not unkindly, but the words landed heavy. "Doesn't make them right." She looked past him toward the hills where the light softened into gold. "My mama used to say you can't outrun what folks want to believe. All you can do is live in a way that makes the truth worth finding." Across the street, Jeb Caro stepped out of the saloon. His boots hit the boardwalk with a weight that made the boards groan. The mayor's face was flushed, his eyes fixed on her like she was some animal cornered. He didn't bother lowering his voice. "You've ruined good men," he called. "Men with families. Men who kept this town running. You think I'll let you keep walking free?" A small knot of townsfolk gathered behind him, the kind that always drift toward a fight. Evelyn straightened fingers tight around the pail handles. Luke moved closer, the shift in his stance subtle but solid. Her voice carried just enough to reach him. "If they were such good men, why'd they pay me for nothing but a pair of hands on their shoulders?" His mouth twisted. "Don't try to sound righteous, girl. You're filth, And filth doesn't belong where decent people drink their water. The ugliness in his tone chilled her more than the words. Luke's jaw worked, but he held back. The square had gone too quiet, the air brittle. Decent people don't spread lies to hide their own shame, she said, each syllable deliberate. I have 2 sick children. That's my truth. What's yours? A flicker, barely there, crossed his face, something like a warning to himself. But he stepped forward, and the knot of onlookers parted for him. Luke put a hand to her elbow. Let's go, he murmured. Not here, not now. They left the square under a sky the color of cooling ashes. On the back trail, the grass whispered under the horses' hooves. Evelyn didn't speak until the town was no more than a smudge in the valley. It's her, isn't it? She said at last. His wife. Luke didn't answer right away. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across his face. I've heard enough to know there's rot in that house. But proof. He shook his head. Proof is what will change minds. Not my word. Not yours. She watched the trail ahead, a hawk circling high above. They'll kill me before they hear it. He glanced over. Not if I'm standing between you and them. For a moment, the quiet was heavier than speech. Then she said, I'm tired of standing alone. You're not alone anymore. When they reached the edge of her small place, she paused to look at the cabin. The porch sagged, the windows clouded with dust. But inside, her children's laughter drifted out thin, but real. She smiled, a weary, fragile curve of the mouth. I keep thinking about the day this will be just another story, she said softly. The kind told by people who've forgotten the taste of it. Luke dismounted, tying his reins. Then let's make sure it's told right. In the dimming light, he took one of the pails from her hand. It was a small thing, but it was the first time in days she felt the weight ease, even if only from her arm. Sometimes healing started that way, not with the clearing of a name, but with someone willing to carry a little of the load until the truth could stand on its own. The wind that swept through Redstone that evening carried more dust than light. Luke rode slow along the back alley behind the mayor's grand house, the leather creak of his saddle keeping time with the steady pound of his heart. He wasn't here for a fight, not yet. He was here for truth. From the upstairs window, a low, rolling laugh spilled out, rich as bourbon, but edged with something sour. Luke slid down from his horse, tied him to a cottonwood, and moved toward the shadows beneath the porch. Through the cracks in the siding, he caught the flicker of lamplight and a glimpse of silk deep green, the kind that catches a man's eye and keeps it. Inside, Clara Caro, the mayor's wife, stood before her, vanity-brushing hair the color of old pennies. She looked like she'd stepped straight out of one of those portraits that hung in the courthouse, the kind meant to remind folks of wealth and respectability. But Luke had spent enough years around men with fine hats and black hearts to know the shine didn't always run deep. I told you, she was saying to the man sitting in the armchair, a ranch foreman Luke recognized. If you open your mouth, you won't live to see another dawn. Do you understand me? The foreman nodded, his hands gripping the chair arms. They're getting sick, Clara. Folks are whispering. Let them whisper, she said, voice like frost over glass. Better they aim it at that little tramp Evelyn Shaw than at me. She's already dirt under their boots. I have too much to lose. Luke felt the words land like stones in his chest. The foreman leaned forward, his voice low but tight. You're the one bringing it in, Clara. You're the reason her brush slammed against the vanity. Careful. She turned, eyes sharp enough to cut. The reason I am the reason this town has a school. The reason there's grain in your bunkhouse. The reason my husband doesn't know what you've been doing behind his back. She took a step closer, her perfume, a cloying blend of lilac and smoke, filling the space between them. One word to Jeb, and you'll hang from the oak by sunrise." The foreman swallowed hard, then stood hat twisting in his hands. "I ain't gonna cross you, ma'am, but you're playing with lives. They're men," she said flatly. "They'll survive, or they won't. Not my concern." The foreman left the front door, closing soft behind him. Luke stayed in the dark, jaw tight. He thought of Evelyn's eyes the night he'd cut her down from the noose, how there'd been fear there. Yes, but also that stubborn light some folks carry, no matter how the world tries to crush it. And here was the real poison wrapped in silk, and wealth using the whole town as a shield. He circled to the side of the house, following the sound of her heels on hardwood until he reached another window. She'd poured herself a glass of wine, the red pooling like blood against the crystal. Her voice softened, almost tender, though Luke knew it was, for no one but herself. "They think I'm untouchable," she murmured. "And they're right." Luke stepped back, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of what he now carried. On his way to the cottonwood, he nearly collided with Marshal Pike, who'd been waiting in the dark. The older man's hat brim shadowed his face, but his eyes met Luke's with something that felt like both warning and weary agreement. "You hear enough?" Pike asked quietly. Luke nodded. "More than enough." "She's dangerous," Pike said. "More dangerous than her husband. Jeb just blusters. Clara, she calculates." Luke stared out toward the open stretch beyond town, the prairie fading into night. Evelyn's rotting in people's minds for something she didn't do, and Clara's feeding them the rope. Pike's jaw worked. "If you bring this out without proof, she'll twist it till it strangles you, and she'll smile while she does it." Luke glanced back at the mayor's house lamplight still glowing warm in the upstairs window. "Then we find proof," he said, "and we put it in the hands of someone she can't buy or scare." Pike studied him a long moment, then nodded once. "I might know a few men tired of holding their tongues, men with nothing left she can take from 'em." A silence stretched between them, filled with the rustle of cottonwood leaves. Luke thought of Evelyn's children, how their small hands had clung to her dress. He thought of his own boy gone now, and the wife whose laughter he could still hear on quiet nights. Loss had a way of hollowing a man out, but sometimes it made room for something new to grow. Marshal Luke said softly, "You ever notice how the truth's like water? You can dam it up, divert it, muddy it, but it always finds a way through." Pike's mouth twitched just shy of a smile. "Let's hope you're right." They walked together toward the edge of town, boots crunching over dry dirt. The moon was climbing, silvering the roofs and fences, laying bare the long shadows. Behind them in the mayor's house, Clara Caro stood alone at her window, sipping her wine, watching the street as though she could see all the way into the darkness where Luke and Pike had disappeared. She smiled faintly, the kind a snake might give before it strikes. But far from her sight, Luke was already making a promise he intended to keep. Not the kind you speak loud, but the kind you carry in the marrow, steady, quiet, and certain. For Evelyn, for her children, for the truth. And somewhere deep down under the grit and the anger, there was something else, an ember of hope, small but stubborn, that maybe this time the truth would come soon enough to save someone worth saving. Evelyn had never felt the air so heavy, as if the lies themselves had thickened it. The little cabin Luke had found for them sat at the edge of the cottonwoods, its porch boards creaking under the weight of her pacing steps. Inside, her children slept fitfully on the bed. They all shared their breathing, ragged from the medicine's aftertaste. She kept the lamp low, afraid the light might draw attention, but the darkness pressed too close. Luke sat at the small table cleaning his revolver. He'd said little since returning from town, his shoulders carrying something she couldn't quite name. When she finally stopped pacing, she saw it in his eyes, disgust, but not at her. "They're doubling down," he said quietly. His voice like gravel rolled in the palm. "Men I've known for years are swearing under oath they were with you. They're looking me in the eye and lying like it costs them nothing." Evelyn sank into the chair opposite him, the wood cold through her dress. "They think it's easier to hang me than tell the truth about her," she murmured. Her hands twisted together. "Do you know what it's like to be hated for something you didn't even touch?" Luke looked at her long and steady, the way a man looks at the horizon, before deciding whether to ride into a storm. "Yeah," he said at last. "I know exactly." From somewhere deep in the night came the sound of a coyote, long, mournful, and lonely. It seemed to draw something out of her. "When you've got no power, they can make you into anything they want," she said. "A liar, a thief, a whore, and you can't wash it off no matter how clean you've lived." The screen door banged softly. Marshal Pike stepped in without knocking. He smelled of sweat and the trail his hat pulled low. His eyes flicked to Evelyn, then to Luke. "Jeb's wife is holding court tonight. Got half the saloon in her pocket. She's smilin' while she poisons every man there. I swear if the devil walked into that room, he'd leave taking notes." Evelyn's stomach turned. "She's winning, isn't she?" "She's got fear on her side," Pike said, setting his hat on the table. "Fear'll make an honest man lie and a guilty one swear on a Bible." Luke's jaw worked, but he kept his voice calm. "We'll break it, piece by piece." Pike shook his head. "You don't know these people like I do. Some of 'em would rather watch an innocent woman swing than admit they've been fooled. Pride's a crueler hangman than rope." Evelyn rose and crossed to the small window, looking out toward the dark tree line. She thought of the women in town who had once bought her. Bread smiled at her in church. Now they turned their faces away. She thought of her children's questions. "Why do people spit when we walk by?" and her silence in answer. Her voice was barely a thread. "I've done nothing but work these hands raw to keep my children alive. And now, my name's filth in their mouths." Luke came to stand beside her, the heat from his body a quiet shield. "They can't touch the truth, Evelyn. Not if we hold it tight." She turned to him, eyes glistening in the lamplight. "But what if the truth isn't enough?" His gaze didn't waver. "Then we make it enough." A shadow crossed the porch, and for a moment she thought it was another of Caro's men. But it was Tom Keene, a wiry ranch hand who'd once brought her milk for the children. He lingered in the doorway, hat twisting in his hands. I need to say something," he stammered. Luke's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Tom's voice cracked. "I ain't never touched her." "But Jeb's wife, she—" He swallowed hard, glancing at Evelyn. "She told me if I ever breathed a word she'd see me hang. I got a wife, 3 kids. I couldn't risk it." The words hung there, heavy and dangerous. Pike stepped closer. "You willing to say that?" "Where it counts." Tom's eyes darted toward the sleeping children. "If it means she don't die for something she didn't do." "Yeah, I am." Evelyn's breath shuddered out, part relief, part fear. She stepped forward, laying a hand on Tom's arm. "You're braver than you think," she said softly. "And braver than most." He flushed, ducking his head. "Don't thank me yet. Jeb's not gonna let this go." When Tom left, the cabin felt smaller, the walls holding in too much truth and too much danger. Luke slid the bolt on the door, then turned to Evelyn. "That's one piece," he said. "We'll find the rest." She sat back down, the tension in her spine easing just enough to let her shoulders drop. "I don't want revenge," she said quietly. "I just want my children to grow up without my name being a curse in their ears." Luke's voice softened, almost a promise. "Then that's what we'll fight for." For a moment, there was no sound but the ticking of the clock and the faint night wind in the cottonwoods. Evelyn thought of all the lies that had been spoken, each one like a stone in her pockets. But tonight, one stone had been lifted. It wasn't much. It was everything. She looked at Luke, at the set of his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes, and felt something shift inside her, something like the first warm wind after a long winter. Maybe the truth could be enough if they held it together. Outside, the coyote called again, and this time it didn't sound so lonely. The wind that swept across the far edge of the prairie that afternoon was dry, laced with dust, and the faint metallic scent of the riverbed. Luke stood by the fence line of the abandoned sheep corral, watching the sky turn a bruised shade of purple. His hat brim shaded his eyes, but not the thoughts running through them. Evelyn sat a few yards away on the split rail, her hands curled in her lap, her children drowsing against her skirt. She'd barely spoken since morning, since word came that 2 more men in town had fallen sick. The crunch of hooves on gravel broke the stillness. A rider approached, swaying slightly in the saddle, his coat worn thin at the elbows. Luke's hand slid toward his holster by instinct, but the man raised both hands, palms out. "I ain't here for trouble," the stranger said, his voice frayed at the edges. "Name's Colby Harlan. I think you need to hear something." Luke's jaw tightened. "You from Redstone, born and raised. And I reckon I've been a damn fool long enough." Colby dismounted with effort, leaning on the fence post, as if the ground tilted under him. Evelyn's gaze narrowed, but she didn't speak. Luke gave a short nod toward the porch. Inside, the light from the stove flickered over Colby's face. He was younger than Luke expected, no more than 30, but his eyes had the hollow, far-off look of a man who'd carried too much shame for too long. "I never touched her," Colby said suddenly, his voice breaking into the hush. "Never so much as laid a hand on Evelyn Shaw. But they told me to say I did." Evelyn's head snapped up. "Who told you?" Colby swallowed hard. "Her, the mayor's wife. Came to me one night. Told me she'd been with me, and if I ever breathed her name she'd see me swinging from the gallows come sunrise. Said she could make a man disappear without a ripple. I believed her." Luke's voice was low even. "And you went along with it." Colby's eyes flicked toward Evelyn, then dropped. "I was scared. She already knew I was sick. Didn't matter that it wasn't from Evelyn. Didn't matter that she's the one spreading it. I was too much of a coward to stand up." The children stirred in their sleep, and Evelyn smoothed their hair, her fingers trembling. "Do you have any idea what your silence cost me?" she asked, not in anger, but in a slow, raw tone that felt heavier than shouting. Colby flinched. "I know. Every day I see my mama in town, and she looks at me like she don't know me anymore. I've got maybe a year left, if that. I don't want to leave this world with this hanging over me." Luke leaned forward, his forearms on his knees. "Then help us. Name the others. Tell us exactly what the mayor's wife has been doing. You willing to stand in front of folks and say it out loud?" Colby hesitated. "You know what that means?" "I do," Luke said. "It means you get your soul back." The words hung there, filling the small space, like the smell of wood smoke. Colby's jaw worked, and for a moment it seemed he might bolt. Then he nodded once. "All right, but if we're doing this, we do it soon. She's got ears everywhere." Outside, the last light was draining from the sky, leaving the land in that quiet blue between day and night. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, her arms wrapped tight around herself. Luke joined her, leaning against the post. "He's telling the truth," Luke said. "I can see it. Fear's been eating him alive." Her eyes stayed on the darkening horizon. "Fear can make a man lie, Luke. But it can also make him tell the truth if he's close enough to the end." He didn't argue. He knew about endings, the sudden ones, the slow ones. He'd buried enough regrets to recognize the weight Colby was carrying. From inside, Colby's voice drifted out murmuring names. Each one was a man who'd lied to save his own skin, a man who'd let Evelyn bear the blame for a sickness she never carried. Luke listened, memorizing every detail. When Colby stepped out to leave, Evelyn stopped him at the gate. For a moment they just stood there, the cold night air moving between them. "I can't forgive what you did," she said softly. "Not today. But I can see you're trying to make it right. Hold on to that." Colby's eyes glistened in the starlight. He tipped his hat, turned, and rode off into the dark. Luke watched him go. "That's one more piece of the truth, Evelyn, and the truth's got a way of pulling the rest of itself into the light." She glanced at him then, and in her look was something fragile but steady, like the first glimmer of dawn on a long, cold trail. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. Some understandings live best in the quiet, where no one can twist them into lies. They stood together on the porch until the sound of Colby's horse faded into the wide-breathing night. And for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt the faint, stubborn pulse of hope beating against the grief in her chest. The barn was quiet, except for the slow creak of the rafters in the night wind. Luke sat at the wooden table with a lantern burning low, the flame trembling as if it knew the weight of the hours ahead. Evelyn stood near the doorway. Her hands clasped her face, pale, but set in a way that told him she'd already faced more storms than most men ever would. "They'll be looking for us by dawn." Luke said, his voice a deep rasp. "If we're going to drag the truth into the open, it has to be tonight." She nodded, though her eyes slid toward the corner where her children slept on a bed of quilts. "And if we fail?" she asked softly. "If we fail," he answered, meeting her gaze, "they'll hang you at sunrise, and I'll likely hang beside you." The words hung between them, heavy and plain. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer to the table, the lantern light catching the faint bruise along her jaw, an old mark from when they'd dragged her out into the square days ago. Luke unrolled a map of Redstone, his finger tracing from the barn to the narrow alley behind the mayor's house. "Marshal Pikes agreed to hold the witnesses at the old feed store until I bring you in. We go in quiet. We get them out. We put them on that stand before the whole town tomorrow." Evelyn studied the map, then his face. "Do you trust him?" "I trust that he hates Caro more than he fears him," Luke said. "That'll have to do." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "I don't want my children to grow up thinking their mother was a coward or a liar." Luke's eyes softened, the kind of softness that came from knowing exactly how deep that fear could root itself. "Then we make sure they remember you standing in the square, telling the truth, even if your knees are shaking." A floorboard groaned. From the shadows, a young cowboy, Tommy, the one Luke had pulled from a beating 2 nights before, stepped into the light. He was pale thin, his eyes darting. "They know," he blurted. "The mayor's men. They're headed to the feed store now." Luke was on his feet before the words finished. "How many? Half a dozen?" "And—" Tommy swallowed hard. "She's with them, the mayor's wife." Evelyn's breath caught a small sound that was more fury than fear. Luke saw it and knew it was the first time she'd let herself think of the woman not as some distant figure of power, but as flesh and blood, someone who could be hurt, someone who could be beaten. "She's not going to let those men talk," Luke said, his voice low. "We stop her tonight, or she buries this for good." They moved quickly, saddling the horses without a word. The night was cold enough to make their breath cloud the stars sharp as nails above them. Evelyn rode behind Luke, her arms tight around his waist, the weight of her resolve pressed into his back. They reached the alley behind the feed store just as a lantern winked out inside. Luke dismounted in one smooth motion, pulling his revolver. Through a crack in the wall, he could see shadows moving the glint of a blade. "Stay here," he told Evelyn. She shook her head. No more hiding. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and sweat. Two of Caro's men were holding Tommy's father against the wall. Another was pressing a knife to the throat of a wiry ranch hand. And there she was, the mayor's wife, in a dress too fine for the filth around her, her gloved hand resting on the shoulder of a man who looked ready to collapse. "You open your mouth tomorrow," she was saying, her voice smooth as oil, "and I'll have your children digging graves by the week's end. Do you understand?" Luke stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. "Seems to me you've dug enough graves for one lifetime." Her eyes snapped to him, the practiced smile freezing for just a moment. "Mr. Donovan, I should have known the stray dog would come sniffing. Funny thing about dogs, he said we bite when we're cornered." The room went still. The mayor's men shifted uneasily. Luke kept his gun steady, his voice even. "Let them go. Tonight's your last chance to walk away before this town knows exactly whose bed they've been in." Her laugh was low, almost pitying. "These men won't talk. Fear is a stronger leash than any you've ever held." That's when Evelyn stepped out from behind Luke, her voice cutting through the stale air. "Not tonight." Something in her tone, steady, unbroken, made even the knife hand pause. She walked forward until she was a step away from the mayor's wife. "You've lived your life thinking no one would dare name you." Evelyn said each word, slow, deliberate. "But I will. Tomorrow, in front of God and everyone. And the only thing they'll fear is the truth." For a moment, the two women stood there, the silence thick enough to choke on. Then the mayor's wife's smile faltered. Just a hair, but enough for everyone to see. Luke moved fast, disarming the nearest man, shoving him toward the door. Marshal Pike appeared in the entry, rifle in hand, and the rest of the mayor's men backed down. They left with the witnesses in tow, the mayor's wife still standing there, her eyes dark as pitch. She didn't speak, but Luke knew she was already thinking of her next move. Back at the barn, the witnesses bedded down in the loft, guarded by Pike. Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching the horizon, where the first gray light was seeping in. Luke joined her, his voice low. "You were steady back there." She didn't look at him, just kept her eyes on that thin line of light. "I've been steady all my life, Luke. Tonight was the first time anyone saw it." He let the silence sit the way an old man might after hearing a truth too sharp to answer right away. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Tomorrow they'll see more than that." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the dry grass, and something else, something like the start of rain. Evelyn drew in a deep breath, and for the first time since he'd met her, Luke saw her shoulders ease. In that small surrender, he knew the fight wasn't over, but the worst of the running was. The wind carried a cold bite that night, the kind that scraped the skin and made the shadows seem sharper. Luke kept his hand steady on the revolver, its weight a quiet reminder of why he'd come back. Behind him, Evelyn stood half hidden in the barn doorway, her arms around the twins. Their faces were pale, but they watched him like he was the last fence post standing before a storm. Across the open yard, lantern light spilled from the porch of the Caro estate. The glow was warm, almost welcoming, until the voice of Jeb Caro cut through the night. "Well, the prodigal gunman returns." Jeb drawled his tone, dripping with the smugness of a man who believed every shadow bowed to him. "Come to bring me more strays? Or is this about the little plague you've been hiding?" Luke took a few steps forward, boots grinding on the frost-hardened dirt. "It's about the truth," he said. His voice was low, but it carried. "You've let the town believe a lie, Jeb. You've let them think she—" He tilted his head toward the barn, brought sickness into their homes. "But you know it wasn't her." From the porch, the mayor's eyes glittered with a cruel kind of pleasure. That's the trouble with folks like you, Luke. You mistake pity for proof. You think a woman's tears are worth more than a man's word. That'll get you killed. Evelyn's voice cut the dark. You destroyed me without lifting a hand. You didn't need a rope, you just needed whispers. Jeb's wife stepped into the lantern light, then her silk dressing gown stirring in the breeze, eyes cold and calculating. Careful, dear, she murmured to her husband, though her gaze never left Luke. Men like him. They cling to women like her because they can't stomach the truth. Luke didn't move. I've spoken to 5 men who'll testify they never touched her. They'll testify to where they really were, and who they were with. Something flickered in the woman's expression, just for a heartbeat. Then she smiled, slow and poisonous. And how many of them are still breathing? Luke, how many will be brave enough to speak once I'm finished with them? A silence fell thick enough to choke on. The twins shifted against Evelyn's skirt, and she tightened her hold on them. Luke took another step closer, his shadow spilling across the steps. You've lived your whole life thinking fear makes you untouchable. But fear cracks. It rots from the inside. And the truth is patient. It waits. For the first time, Jeb's voice rose not with confidence, but with a fraying edge. You've got nothing, Donovan. You're chasing ghosts. Maybe Luke said eyes never leaving the mayor's wife, but ghosts have a way of showing up when the night's quiet enough. A gust of wind rattled the shutters. From somewhere beyond the porch, Marshal Pike emerged, hat pulled low, a folded paper in his hand. Got your ghosts right here, he said, his voice like gravel under a wagon wheel. Statements. Signed. Names. Times. Enough to set every man in this town against you once they hear it. Jeb's wife's composure cracked just barely. Her lips tightened, a muscle in her jaw twitching. Evelyn stepped forward now, out of the barn's shadow. I don't want revenge, she said quietly. I want my children to grow up in a town where a lie doesn't decide a life. Can you even imagine what that feels like? For a moment, no one moved. Then Jeb's wife laughed, low and brittle. Your children will forget all of this in time. People forget. Evelyn's reply was soft, but it carried like church bells on a still morning. Mothers don't. The marshal moved closer to Luke's side. We should go. Dawn'll bring the crowd and we'll need every voice ready. Luke nodded, but before turning away, he met the mayor's wife's eyes one last time. You've got until sunrise, he said. After that, your name won't be feared, it'll be cursed. They walked back toward the barn, the crunch of frost beneath their boots loud in the quiet. Evelyn's fingers brushed Luke's arm, a small, steadying touch. Thank you, she whispered. He glanced at her, the lines in his face deep in the lantern glow. Don't thank me yet. The night's not over. But as they reached the doorway where the twins waited, Evelyn saw it, a shift in him, like a man remembering there was more than just battles and debts. There were lives worth coming back for. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay and horsehide. The children clung to their mother, their small hands warm against her sides. Luke set his gun on the workbench and began checking the latches on the doors. Outside, the wind kept moving restless through the dark. But inside, in that small circle of lamplight, something steadier took root, a promise unspoken, but no less real for it. And for the first time in months, Evelyn felt the night might finally give way to morning. The morning air in Redstone was brittle with cold, yet the square swelled with bodies, men in dusted hats, women clutching shawls, tight children peeking between skirts. Frost clung to the wooden railings, and breath rose in pale ribbons. In the center, a rough-hewn table had been dragged out, papers and a lantern placed atop it. Marshal Pike stood to one side, his arm bound in a sling, the badge on his chest catching the thin light. Evelyn Shaw stood beside Luke Donovan, her shoulders straight, chin lifted. The twins clung to her skirt, their eyes wide and searching. The rope burns at her wrists were hidden beneath the cuffs of Luke's old coat. She did not speak yet. She was listening to the rustle of the crowd, the way whispers carried like dry leaves. Across the table, Mayor Jeb Caro shifted a slick smile pasted on his face. His wife, in her dark feathered hat, sat ramrod straight behind him, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. "This is an insult to this town." Jeb's voice cut through the murmurs. "We've gathered here for justice, not for the circus this drifter has dragged into our square." Luke's gaze held steady. "Justice is exactly what we came for." His voice was even, but it carried low and firm over the crowd. Marshal Pike cleared his throat, nodded to a young ranch hand standing near the table. The boy's hands trembled as he stepped forward. His face was pale eyes darting toward the mayor's wife, and then away. "Speak," son Pike urged. The boy swallowed. I never lay with Miss Shaw." His voice cracked, but he went on. It wasn't her. It was—" He hesitated, knuckles white around the brim of his hat. The mayor's wife's gaze cut like glass. "Careful," she said, her tone dripping with cold steel. "A tongue can be a dangerous thing in a place like this." Something in Evelyn's chest twisted at the sound, a reminder of the nights in the cell, the threats whispered by shadows. Luke stepped closer to the boy, his hand resting lightly on the table. "No more fear. You tell it plain. Today's the day." The boy's eyes flicked to Evelyn, then to the faces in the crowd. "It was her," he said, voice suddenly louder, pointing at the mayor's wife. She came to me, and to others. She said, if we told we'd hang. And now there's 6, some gone already. And we all let them blame her instead." Gasps rippled through the crowd, sharp as gunfire. A murmur swelled, people turning toward the woman in the feathered hat. The mayor's face flushed deep crimson. Lies from a boy too stupid to know the cost of slander. Marshal Pike reached into his coat, pulled out a leather-bound ledger, its pages creased and stained. "This came from your own house, Jeb. Names, dates, payments. It's all here." The mayor's wife's lips curled, a flicker of something pride, defiance before settling into disdain. "And what will you do with your pretty little accusations? This town owes me its place in the territory. Without me, you're nothing but dust and cattle." Evelyn stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air. "Without truth, we're less than that." She looked directly at the mayor's wife, not with hatred, but with the weariness of someone who had carried too much weight for too long. "You let them tear me apart to hide your own shame. You watched my children cry for me, knowing I was innocent. Tell me, did that help you sleep?" The woman's eyes faltered just for a moment. From the back of the crowd, an older man called out, "I saw her too. Not Evelyn, the other one. We all knew, but we were too scared." Another voice followed, then another, until a low chorus rose, admitting what had been locked away in silence. Jeb slammed his fist on the table. "You think you can take my wife on the word of cowards and whores?" Luke's eyes hardened. "No, we take her on the truth. And today the truth isn't scared of you anymore." 2 deputies stepped forward, one of them removing his badge and tossing it at Jeb's feet. "I won't carry your shame any longer." The mayor's wife's hands tightened in her lap as the deputies moved to take her. She did not fight, but her gaze never left Evelyn. "This town will eat you alive, girl," she murmured as they led her away. Evelyn didn't answer. She turned instead to the twins kneeling to meet their eyes. "It's over," she whispered, brushing a curl from Nell's cheek. "It's really over. Luke helped her to her feet. Around them, the crowd had fallen into a hush, some faces ashamed, others relieved, a few smiling faintly, as if the sun had just broken through after a long storm. Marshal Pike set the ledger on the table, his voice rough. "Your name's cleared, Miss Shaw. You can walk this town as free as any of us." Evelyn looked out over the square at the worn boards of the general store, the sagging porch of the saloon, the church steeple cutting into the pale winter sky. For months, every nail and stone had felt like part of her cage. Now they felt different. Not safe yet, but possible. Luke touched her elbow lightly. Ready to go home. Her gaze found his, and there was something unspoken there. Gratitude, maybe, or the first fragile threads of trust. "Yes," she said, and her voice didn't shake. They walked together through the parting crowd, the twins holding tight to Evelyn's hands. People stepped aside, some nodding, a few reaching out to touch her arm as she passed. As they reached the edge of the square, the church bell began to ring, slow and deep, marking the hour. Evelyn paused, listening. She thought of her mother's kitchen long ago, of Sunday mornings, and the way her father's hand had felt on her shoulder. She thought of the months she'd spent trying to keep her children alive under the weight of lies. Luke waited beside her, not hurrying, letting the moment breathe. "It's strange," she said softly, "how a sound can feel like a promise." He nodded. "Some promises are worth keeping." They started down the dirt road together, the winter sun low behind them, their shadows stretching long across the frost. Somewhere ahead, there would be work to do, fences to mend, children to raise, a life to rebuild. But for now, each step felt lighter than the last, and behind them in the square where her name had been dragged through the dust, the echoes of the truth still hung in the cold air, quiet, steady, unshakable. The square of Redstone had never been so quiet. The wind that usually dragged grit across the boardwalks seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was waiting. Men and women crowded the edges, hats in their hands, eyes fixed on the makeshift platform. The morning sun slanted low, catching the worn grain of the gallows beam that had nearly ended Evelyn Shaw's life not weeks ago. Luke stood at the foot of the platform, one hand resting on the butt of his Colt, the other open at his side. Beside him, Marshal Pike swayed slightly, his arm bound tight from the gunfight the night before. Between them, trembling but upright, stood three men who had once sworn Evelyn was the devil in a white dress. "You speak now," Pike rasped, "or you carry this lie to your graves." The youngest of the three cleared his throat. His voice was no more than a frayed thread. "It wasn't her. She never touched us. We lied because we were told to." His eyes darted toward the balcony of the mayor's office. Gasps rustled through the crowd. Somewhere, a woman's voice whispered a prayer. From the balcony, Jeb Caro stepped forward, boots ringing against the wood. His face was a mask carved from pride and fear. "This is slander!" He barked, the words echoing too loud in the stillness. "You think I'll let a pack of cowards and a washed-up lawman smear my name?" Evelyn stood just beyond Luke's shoulder, the brim of her bonnet shadowing her face. Her hands, calloused from years of work, clenched tight at her sides. "I was never your enemy, Jeb," she said softly, but her voice carried. "You made me into a monster, so no one would see the one standing in your own house." A ripple moved through the crowd as eyes turned toward the mayor's wife. She stood half hidden behind the drapes, her lips a thin line. Luke took a step forward, holding up a ledger. "Payments," he said simply, "from your wife's hand to these men, and not for silence over me or Evelyn. For silence over her." He let the book fall open, pages flapping in the wind. Caro's jaw worked, a vein standing out in his neck. "You think anyone will believe this? They fear me." "Not anymore." Pike said, his voice slow and heavy. "Fear only lasts until truth walks in." The mayor's wife emerged then, shoulders squared, eyes flat as glass. "I did what I had to," she said. "Do you know what it is to be trapped in a marriage built on bargains and lies? I found my own comfort. And when I grew tired of the gossip, I cut it off at the root." Her smile was a cold, precise thing. "You were convenient, Evelyn. Alone. Poor. Easy to burn." Evelyn's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "You could have ruined me with words alone. But you wanted my children to grow up under the weight of a rope they'd never deserved. That's the part I can't forgive." The older women in the crowd shifted, their faces tightening. They knew that kind of cruelty, the kind that wore silk gloves. Luke's voice was low but steady. "We're done here. The people of Redstone will decide what justice looks like for you." And for the first time, the mayor looked small. Smaller than the gallows beam, smaller than the shadow cast by the truth. He reached for his wife's arm, but she stepped away, her eyes already scanning the crowd for escape. Marshal Pike moved in, laying a hand on Caro's shoulder. "You'll come with me." As the couple was led down from the balcony, murmurs swelled into something heavier, the sound of a town waking from a long fever. Luke turned to Evelyn. For a moment, neither spoke. Her bonnet slipped back, and the morning light found her eyes clear, unbroken. "They can't give me back the years," she said, voice thick, "but they can't take another one." Luke nodded. "Not while I'm breathing." Her children ran to her, then arms flung around her waist. She knelt, gathering them in, the three of them, a small circle of warmth in the center of the square. An old woman, one of the ones who'd muttered about sin and shame, stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held out a folded handkerchief. "For the dust," she said. Evelyn took it without a word, the gesture heavier than any apology. The sun climbed higher, washing the square in gold. The gallows beam stood empty, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt light. Somewhere, a church bell began to toll, not for an execution, but for the hour. Luke offered his hand, and Evelyn took it. They walked toward the open street, the children skipping between them, their small laughter chasing away the last shadows. In the hush that followed, the people of Redstone stood a little straighter, as if they'd all been given back something they thought was gone forever. And perhaps they had. The morning sun came slow over Redstone, laying its gold across the frost-tipped grass. Evelyn stood at the edge of Luke's porch, her hands curled around a chipped coffee mug, steam drifting into the cold. The twins were somewhere behind her, their small voices chasing each other through the kitchen. She didn't turn to look. She wanted this moment, the sound of life moving again, without fear breathing down its neck. Luke stepped out quietly, boots soft on the worn boards. He carried nothing but the quiet weight of a man who'd seen too much and chosen to stay anyway. For a while they just looked at the land, his land now theirs, the fields stretching toward the horizon, like a promise that no one else could claim. "You slept." His voice was low, as though afraid the answer might shatter the stillness. "Not much," she said. "But it's the first night I didn't dream about running." Luke nodded, eyes narrowing at the line of cottonwoods along the creek. "That's how it starts, not the big changes. Just one night, you're not running." She almost smiled, but the memory of the square still burned, the rope at her neck. The crowd's eyes filled with something uglier than hate relief, as if they needed her guilt to excuse their own. She swallowed hard. "I heard what Jeb said before you came for me," she murmured. "She's the devil killing men for coin." Her hands tightened around the mug. He wanted them to believe it so bad I think he started believing it himself. Luke's jaw set. "A lie's got a way of rotting the one who tells it. You saw it on him." "I saw worse," she said. His wife's eyes when they dragged her out. Not fear, not shame, just cold. She shivered despite the coffee's heat. like she was sorry for nothing. He turned to her, then the wind lifting the brim of his hat. "Some folks don't have a word for sorry. You and me, we've both met our share." The door creaked behind them, and Nell stepped out, hair tangled one of Luke's old flannels, swallowing her small frame. She pressed into Evelyn's side, silent. Evelyn kissed the top of her head. Noah appeared next, clutching the wooden horse Luke had carved by firelight 2 nights ago. Luke crouched, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That horse runs fast, don't it?" Noah nodded solemnly. "Faster than bad men." Luke met Evelyn's gaze over the boy's head. It was the closest they'd come to saying they were safe. From across the yard came the crunch of hooves. Marshal Pike rode in slow, one arm still bound from the night in the square. He dismounted with a wince, tipping his hat. "Town's quiet," he said. "Quieter than I've ever seen it. Folks are talkin'. Not all kind, but not all poison anymore." He glanced at the children, then back to Evelyn. "You've got more on your side than you think." Evelyn's voice was steady. "I'm not going back there." "No one's asking you to," Pike replied. "But if you ever want to stand in that square for yourself, I'll be there. Truth deserves to be seen standing." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Maybe one day." Pike touched his hat again and rode off, leaving only the sound of hooves fading down the road. They went about the morning in the slow rhythm of new beginnings, Luke mending a fence rail, Evelyn hanging wash in the pale sun, the children chasing the barn cat through patches of thawing mud. At noon, they sat at the rough-hewn table Luke had built years ago, the wood worn smooth by no one in particular, waiting for someone to come home. Halfway through the meal, Evelyn set down her fork. "I used to think forgiveness was for the ones who hurt you," she said softly, "like it was some kind of gift you gave them." Luke looked up from his plate. "And now I think it's for the ones who survived them." He didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth lifted in something like agreement. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of dying embers, Luke found her out by the fence line. She was leaning against the post, watching the twins race each other to the creek. "You've got a good view from here," he said. "I've had worse," she replied, but her eyes stayed on the children. "They laugh easy now. I didn't think I'd hear that again." He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers on the fence post. "You will. Every day you choose to stay." For a long time they stood without speaking, the cold air filled with the small sounds of life, the creek's low gurgle, the clatter of pebbles under small feet, the whisper of grass. When she finally looked at him, the last of the sun caught in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. "Don't thank me. Just live here. That's enough." Night came gentle without the old weight of fear pressing at the windows, and in the morning when the first light crept over the land, Evelyn was already awake, the twins still dreaming inside. She stepped onto the porch, pulling Luke's coat tight around her shoulders, and breathed in the scent of wood smoke and frost. It was for the first time in a long time the scent of a place she might call home.